To many of his enemies in the north, King Ivar was known as a massive, brutal vestige of war. He was an annihilator, and often near single-handedly smote entire hordes of opposing forces. He was a godlike ruler with a godlike appetite for food, wine, and folly. But he was an ardent protector of his people, which included his lovely motherless daughter, Freyja. Ivar adored his daughter, and now settling into the later years of his life, looked forward to the day when she would inherit the crown, and he would be ushered into Valhalla, ideally by the hand of a majestic Valkyrie. During the last hunt of the season, when the village gardens were full of harvestable beans, hops, carrots, and wild cabbage, King Ivar would indeed finally meet that glorious end in the dark, mysterious forest that brushed the shores of their small island. While tracking a rather large moose through the dense woods, an enormous stalking bear had sprung forth and tore King Ivar down. The ferocious monolith snapped his bones and bit him to bits. King Ivar was done in by a great crush of his skull by the jaws of the great beast. He succumbed to his injuries before he could be met in the village by his capable shaman and healers. They dressed Ivar well for his funeral and lowered his heavy body into his prized ship, which was resting in a deep, unearthed mound fit for a king. The settlement was beside itself. Bows, axes, shields and swords were attentively laid inside a large oak coffin, along with his linen-wrapped remains. Rain fell upon the grave goods, making a macabre, tinkling melody to mourn to. King Ivar would certainly appreciate these items in the afterlife, they thought. And Freyja, his daughter, was now queen. The autumn winds wildly whipped her long, wispy lemon-yellow hair around her ceremonial antler headdress, which was adorned with a gleaming trim of bronze and gold. Her wool cloak kept off the chilling air, which iced her tear-streaked cheeks. Her ladies attended to her sweetly and offered their genuine sympathies, but it was useless. She was despondent and uncharacteristically pessimistic. Distant thunder thumped against her chest. Questions burned through her pounding heart. How could she rule without her father to counsel her? Why hadn't she paid more attention to all of his advice and just keep her head out of the clouds? How could she ever live up to his greatness? How could she raise the future kings of their tribe without his guidance? How could he be so foolish and careless in the woods? Didn't he know how important he was to their people? How important to her? And now, if Ragnarok were to befall them that very evening, could Freyja be ready to protect them, to lead them to victory? She scanned the helpless crowd with her clear blue eyes, and every face they fell upon was twisted with shock, grief, and worst of all, fear. They were left vulnerable without their attested king to ensure they endure the coming winter. She wished she could have at least said goodbye. Just one last smile from that mammoth of a man. As Ivar's respected warriors and friends began shoveling mud and dirt back into the mound, Freyja began to feel faint. She stole away from the scene before anyone could spot the crack in her porcelain facade of reserved strength. She heard a faint voice reverberating from the nearby cliffs. It strangely sounded like her own voice. It was calling her name, beckoning her. She couldn't decide if the sound lived solely in her own mind. Confused but curious, she walked out into the open field of tall grass that led to the plunging edge of the island. Meanwhile, the villagers had just finished stacking the last few rocks on top of the burial cairn. Though it was raining, they still had the warmth and light of the mid-afternoon sun. But soon, the ground around them darkened, and it was nearly impossible to see those standing right beside them. They looked towards the sky and found that the moon was slowly passing in front of the sun, shielding the settlement from its light. It was a harrowing experience for many of them, and they instinctually scurried inside with their families. But Freyja, already leagues away from shelter, didn't have time to react. An entrancing warbling noise pulsed above her head. Through the darkness of the eclipse, she spotted a great mass descending from the mist-like clouds in the sky. Freyja was sure it had to be a rock-hide dragon coming to swoop her up from the hillside. But as it lowered closer to the ground, she could see it was more of a slab of shiny, floating iron rock. Then, without warning, a great beam of swirling light cast down upon her. She was in awe of the luminance and was frozen in place. Her still tearing eyes peered up at the bright, hypnotizing vortex of dancing light. The penetrating beam was pouring from the great floating slab above. Under its trance, she failed to notice she was no longer standing on solid ground. Her damp, hide-covered feet were free to kick to and fro, but she had no control over her imminent ascent. She felt as if she was suspended in water. The surrounding light was painfully piercing to the eye, but it felt neither hot nor cold on her skin. A part of the rock slab slid open underneath, and she was pulled toward the source of the light, and then she couldn't feel or see anything at all. It was like she had fallen up into nothing, and for Freyja's sake, the nothingness was much needed at the moment. She woke up slowly and was groggy, as if she had been asleep for days, maybe even weeks. She was lying on her back on a long, smooth crystal bed. A white light pulsed through the bottom of it and illuminated her body, which was stripped of its woolen clothes and hammered metal jewelry. Panic set in. She lifted her head, but found that it was strapped down with some strange material that felt like hide, but was cool and smooth on her forehead. She couldn't lift her arms or legs, as they were also restrained by cording that was tougher than anything she'd ever known. In her peripheral, between the pulses of the light below her, she could see hundreds of flexible, translucent reed-like tubes sprouting from her chest, face, and arms. She was covered with symmetrical, evenly spaced rows of these tiny, vacuous tendrils that flowed away from her. As she began to tremble and shudder from nervousness, she could see them wiggling and pulsing with her heartbeat. They were now simply a part of her. She couldn't see anything else in the room with her. It was black in every corner, but she could hear what sounded to her like birds and the insects of the night chirping from somewhere through the abyss. She called out to anyone who could hear her, but she didn't receive a response. Hours seemed to pass in silence. She wondered how long she had been there. Could it have been days? Years? Who could have captured her so rashly without attracting the attention of her protective warriors? And why had her warriors not yet come to rescue her? She hated the feeling of being so utterly alone with nothing but grief to keep her company. She wasn't hungry or thirsty, but her stomach was completely empty and her mouth was dry. Her head was starting to ache. She called again for help, urging her captors to find mercy and release her. Amidst her pleas, an image suddenly flashed in her mind. It was like a memory she had never lived herself. Another flash of unfamiliar faces and places poured through her consciousness. Sometimes they would stretch across her psyche like lightning, or flicker gently at the back of her mind, like misremembered dreams in campfire light. She heard sounds she couldn't identify or understand, and they terrified her. The hundreds of tubes digging into her skin now started to glow on their own. It was a bright blue pulse that matched her heartbeat. She fidgeted and tossed her head around in a bid to somehow fling away the thoughts surging through her brain unprovoked. It was like she was sharing a world with someone else within the same body. She fought against her own limbs, failing to move them as she would her own. Her vision doubled, then quadrupled. She began to sing and vocalize uncontrollably in a language foreign to her. She wept and laughed inexplicably, like someone else was attempting to master her as well. Their sentiment was similar to hers. They both wanted it all to stop. The sensation of pairing with this other soul was unnerving yet exhilarating in the worst way. The nauseating intensity of the fusion caused her eyes to slosh and roll toward the back of her head. She could taste blood trickling down from her nostrils across her dry, cracked lips. Through her dizzied state, she could hear something stirring from behind her, and the psychic assault halted abruptly. It sounded like the rattling and squeaking of bones twisting against bare joints. A clicking noise reverberated off of the walls of the room, which she now realized was smaller than she thought. The buzzing rattle, though gentle, was increasing in volume as it moved closer to her head. There were no footsteps, but she could hear the creaking of skeletal wings fluttering near her. She looked up as far as the boundaries of her skull would allow, but her coy company was just out of sight. She sucked in deep breaths through her nose in an attempt to sniff out the perpetrator. But she smelled nothing except dried blood, and the strange, burning scent emanating from the reflective walls around her. She called out once more, telling it her name. She threatened them with the retaliation that would befall them if they didn't return her at once. The chittering was now right behind her, and it had morphed into her own voice, repeating her threats back onto her. The voice was metallic, as if spoken through a crystal cave, and was harsh like the voice of a demon in the night. But it had matched her inflection, and it stunned the poor queen into submissive silence. Out of the corners of her aching eyes, she saw a pair of long, bony, finger-like appendages closing in on either side of her ivory face. The sounds of its creaking body took her nerves past their limit. The fingers nearly touched her skin as she let out a terrified scream. The creature seemed terrified itself, as it also screamed, followed by a vicious hissing noise. She could hear clamoring as it retreated back into the shadows of the room. Freyja could feel her heart beating in her throat as adrenaline shocked her system. She clenched her teeth and growled, tugging violently against her restraints on the glass table, banging her body against any surface that she could possibly leverage against to free herself. She called out for her father, hoping he hadn't crossed over just yet and could still somehow help her. She could hear the chirps and beeps around her increase steadily to match the depth of her panic. And then came the first blast of energy, like lightning seizing her entire body. Her muscles and organs stiffened as a jolt of electricity was shot through her. The current subsided, and the muscle contractions stopped. She could hear the beeps and chirps start to diminish. Another round of energy blasted through her body, this time taking her breath away. She had no control over her thoughts or senses, and she lost the little visibility she had in the room. The instruments surrounding her rang together in unison in what she assumed was their last great chorus. She prayed for it all to be over soon. Focusing on the memories of her father, she wished she could be with him wherever he was. She thought back on the last time they were together, fishing on the banks near their village. He still had so much to teach her about life and about being a queen. But now she was helpless, being harshly drug up to the gates of Valhalla by some strange, unseen assailant. The tubes connected to her body, again pulsed with a bright blue light. But this time, an ether-like fluid dribbled through them from somewhere just beyond the pitch blackness of the room. The fluid flowed into her limbs, torso, and face. It was cooling, and it immediately calmed her. It was as if she had forgotten the source of her terror, and eventually she was merely an empty vessel trapped in the stale passage of time.
Freyja.
Then she heard him. His voice was bright and clear. He called her name, the way he always did when trying to steal her away from her own imagination. A churning medley of his thunderous voice paraded through the darkness like starlit memories.
It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up.
He said to her from somewhere in the room.
Today is a big day for you. You have much to do and very little time to do it. And very little time to do. They'll be waiting for you. They'll be waiting for you. I love you, Freyja. I love you, Freyja. She would have been so proud of you. You'll make a great queen and bear the descendants of a great empire. And bear the descendants of a great empire.
Mother, wake up!
A ringing in her ears started slowly until it was nearly deafening. All the blood in her body seemed to start pumping again. The chirps returned, steady and strong, her eyes fluttered. The gentle rush of reinstated consciousness was intoxicating. Then it was silent once more. She slipped back into another long, restful sleep to recover from this powerful, disquieting encounter. When she finally awoke, she felt the stinging brightness of natural sunlight through the soft fabric draped over her face. She could hear the waves crashing against the rocks at the base of the cliffs nearby, and the movement of air above her head. She could hear the sound of distant thunder rolling across the sea. These ambient sounds were alien to her now. Somehow she had forgotten how loud her world could be. Newfound suspicions were creeping into her thoughts. Was all of this real? Where had she gone? How long had she been there? Was she somehow still there? Was she still her? Was she still Freyja, the bereaved queen of the north? She must be, for in the distance, she could hear a small group of people tramping towards her through the open field, calling to her by name. As the feeling came back to her body, she realized she was lying on the cold, wet grass on her back. She sat up and pulled the sheer cloth veil away from her face, wrapping it tightly around her head. She squinted through the blinding light of midday. The sun was once again free from its captivity by the moon. She could barely stand, but she now had her tribe around her to help her to her feet. They were concerned with where she had gone for those few brief moments they couldn't find her. Moments? Freyja asked herself. The confusion debilitated her. She had no words for them. She must have been gone for months, perhaps years, she thought. The stress overwhelmed Freyja, and she pulled down the garment from her head to cool herself in the blustery, salted sea wind. Her tribe was aghast at what they saw. Covering her face were swirling tracks of small, circular markings. Underneath the scar tissue looked to be tiny mounds that were hard like gems or crystals. As they reached with their fingertips to examine them, the marks pulsed gently with a mysterious glowing shade of blue from just under her supple skin. What was slightly less perplexing, but odd all the same, was that her ceremonial dress was now on backward. She must have been visited by the gods to give her their blessing, they concluded joyously. Her most trusted lady wrapped Freyja's shoulders with a wool shawl and secured it with a copper and crystal brooch. As the woman adjusted it, the talisman grew hot and nearly burned the woman's fingers. Something came over Freyja. She could hear her father's voice in her head, playfully chasing after her psyche.
It is time, my daughter. Awaken.
Freyja raised both hands to calm her clan and clear them away. She stood on her own 2 feet, feeling the ground energy feeding her through them. Her hair lifted by static electricity plumed from her head. The same sudden eerie calm she felt from the blue cosmic ether in the shadow room now matched the growing certainty in her soul back on Earth. She had finally reached clarity. She was who she was meant to be. Freyja, daughter of Ivar, Queen of the North and very soon a maiden of great magic. Her people asked her if she was feeling well enough to return to the village and finish what they started earlier that afternoon. Thunder clapped across the frightened and uncertain tribe in her midst. Freyja couldn't lie to them. She had never felt more ready.